go. Okay. So I'm Dawn with the James Kennedy Public Library. Thank you all for attending. We are happy to have Joesph LeValley here with us. He is a lifelong Iowan. He has had success in 4 careers, and he's here to talk about his journalism career and how that inspired a series of mystery thriller novels that he has written, which, as Mary mentioned earlier, the library does have. We're happy to say that we do have for you to borrow, or you can buy them from Joe's as well. This program is being recorded, and it will be posted to the library's Facebook and YouTube channels and pages until December 5th. So please let people you know that weren't able to be here tonight that they can come back and watch it afterwards. And with that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Well, thanks, Don. I appreciate it. And I'm very honored to have you all take a little bit of time to hear my story and a little bit about these books. You know, I said to Jane, my wife, did you ever in your wildest dreams think that I would be doing author talks for libraries and service clubs all over the Midwest and actually as far west as Utah? And Jane said, Joe, you're not in my wildest dreams. But let me begin by saying that I have an imaginary friend. His name is Tony Harrington, and he has been in my head for 35 years or so. And so I thought I would tell you a little bit about how he was created and how he's helped me to write these novels and transition from healthcare executive to retiree and create a new career for me. I've been very blessed in my life to have some success in 4 careers. I was a musician, and I'm proud to say I'm in the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's a whole nother story. I was a journalist, and I was a healthcare executive for 30 years, and now I'm enjoying tremendously the life of an author. But in any case, as Dawn said, the books really stem from the years that I was a reporter. And my primary beat, and I worked, you know, at daily newspapers in Iowa, so they're modest size and you do a little bit of everything. But my primary beat was police and courts. I spent a lot of time riding around in cop cars, hanging out with DCI agents, and I spent a lot of time sitting in courtrooms. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Also did a lot of feature writing, and when I talk to journalism classes, when I speak to students, I love telling an absolutely true story that I had a day where I covered the Sandy Frank murder trial in the morning. And the jury came in about 11 a.m. with a guilty verdict. Sandy Frank was found guilty of killing George O'Hara. And I went back to the office and wrote that story for the next day's paper. And then I drove across town to Dave Friedley's house and got in his hot air balloon and went for a hot air balloon ride to do a feature story about ballooning. And I love to say to people, you know, how many careers are there where you can be in a murder trial in the morning and a hot air balloon in the afternoon and get paid for both? Not paid very much, right, Mary? But paid for both. So I loved it. I love to write. I've always loved to write. I was one of those kids who wrote poetry and short stories when I was in middle school and high school. I was blessed to have good teachers, and I never doubted that I wanted a career in writing. And even my healthcare career, I went in through the public relations door as a communications person and spent as much of my time at the computer writing. Even when I was a senior vice president, my primary job involved a lot of writing. So I do love it. in terms of feature stories, just a couple of things I would mention. One is Sheriff Jerry Allen called me one day. I actually have this picture I might share with you if I can pull it up. I'm going to try to share my screen here real quick. Can you guys see that picture?
Not yet. Now it's just coming up.
There a black and white picture of a man sitting at a desk?
Yep, we can see
Okay.
it.
Well, that's Sheriff Jerry Allen. And he was a longtime sheriff in Sarasota County, which is where Mason City is, which is where I was working as a reporter. And he called me one day and he said, grab your camera and come over here. And I did. And he was sitting at his desk with these things spread out in front of him. And what's on the desk there is Buddy Holly's famous black rim glasses. Most of you probably know Buddy Holly was a rock star who died in a plane crash in Iowa. And the pocket watch that Sheriff Allen's holding belonged to the Big Bopper, and the dice belonged to Richie Valens. And so the story was that 20 years after the plane crash, they had been in the basement of the courthouse, cleaning out the courthouse, and they found a box with all of this personal effects from the plane crash. Somehow had never been returned to the families and was still sitting in the basement of the courthouse. So I took this picture and wrote a story about it. And it's the only story I ever did that made the International Associated Press. This picture ran in newspapers all over the world. The Des Moines Register reprints this picture every once in a while when they're doing a story about the anniversary of the crash or a new release of a movie or something. They'll show this picture. They always caption it a Des Moines Register file photo, which is reasonably irritating to me, but trust me, that's a picture I took. So in any case, I had the opportunity to do a lot of feature writing. I interviewed a lot of celebrities. Meredith Willson, who wrote The Music Man, was from Mason City, and I wrote a story about him. I have a lovely handwritten thank you letter from him. On tape, I have an hour and 45-minute interview with Ron Howard from Mayberry and Happy Days, and now, of course, a very famous movie director. When I interviewed him, he had directed 2 or 3 movies, but he wasn't yet, didn't have the stature that he has now as a director. But it was fascinating, and he was a lovely man. And I also have a handwritten thank you note from him. So lots of great experiences. And the last thing I would mention on the feature side is we had an editor who was loved to experiment. And that was a great blessing because Bill Brzee started this thing. He thought that the readers of the Globe Gazette needed to know the reporters on a more personal level. He thought TV reporters had a leg up on newspaper reporters because when a TV reporter calls you, you can picture in your mind what they look like. You know, they're in your living room every night. You kind of feel like you know them. And he thought the newspaper needed to do something to try to capture some of that same feeling. So he he required us to write a personal column for the paper every week. Maximum of 18 column inches. It ran every week with our picture by it. And some reporters hated that. You know, it was like a looming deadline every week. They just dreaded it. But I absolutely loved it because I could write anything I wanted. Political opinions, schmaltz. I wrote about my first date with the woman I eventually married. I wrote about our honeymoon. I wrote about my cat. I wrote about tragedies I covered in the news, as well as funny things that happened. One week I got a letter from God. I mean, it literally said, "Dear Mr. LeValley, this is the Almighty God," and made great column material. But it was wonderful training ground to write different kinds of things. When my grandmother's best friend passed away, Margaret Ludgegren, I wrote a column about what a special person she was and how much she meant to our family, even though we weren't related. And her family today, 30 years later, still, if they see me, talks about that column I wrote. In fact, Friday, I got a card in the mail with a picture of Margaret Ludgegren with another thank you from a column I wrote probably 35 years ago. So anyway, great experiences in covering all kinds of things. But on the crime and court side, in 7 years of reporting, I covered 8 homicides. 2 of them were double murders, and 6 of them were solved and went to trial. So I sat through 6 murder trials. And I really was fascinated by the justice system, what I sometimes call the criminal injustice system. I was fascinated by the strategies and tactics used by the attorneys. But I also was fascinated, maybe that's not the right word, pardon me, concerned that justice isn't always done in the courtroom. And there's reasons for that. Life is rarely black and white. Sandy Frank pretty clearly killed George O'Hara. She beat him to death with a wrench. Her palm print was in his blood, a couple of feet above his body on the refrigerator. Not too much doubt about that one. But a lot of times it's not that clear, and sometimes juries make real mistakes. I've seen a judge explode angrily at a jury because they came back with a verdict that was ridiculous compared to the evidence. And for me, one of the hardest things was that juries often were dismissed to go deliberate. The trial, the presentation of the evidence and the closing arguments are done. They get their instructions. They're sent back to the jury room to deliberate. And as they walk out of the room, I'm sitting there. And as a reporter, I have more information about what happened than the jury has, or I have more information about the defendant than the jury has. And of course, there's reasons for that. There's rules of evidence and all those things that come into play, procedural things and all that, usually designed to protect the defendant, but sometimes the prosecution as well. But no matter what, the reason was I always felt bad when I had more facts than the jury had, and they're expected to decide this person's fate. A real stark example of this is Hector Luna, and I see Dennis is on the call. If it's the Dennis Carlson, I think it is. He may remember this case. He lived in North Iowa at the time. I love that. But Hector Luna was staying overnight with his girlfriend and in her apartment, and her phone rang late at night. It was another guy, and she chatted with him. And while she was on the phone, Hector got up out of bed and went to the kitchen. She finished her conversation, hung up the phone. Hector walked in the room with a butcher knife and stabbed her 56 times. He served 18 months in jail. And you know, every audience I described this to, their eyes get big and they wonder, how could that happen? And it was exactly what I just described, where the jury didn't have all the information it needed to make the right decision. Um, so justice isn't always done. And the reason I'm making such a point of this is it really did directly lead to the first novel. So I was sitting in a trial one day, and a guy's on trial for murder, one of those double homicides, and the evidence against him is clear. You know, all this physical evidence is piled up on the table, and it's obvious that he did it, and he was found guilty. But just for fun, I don't know if fun's the right word, but as an interesting exercise, I asked myself, what if he didn't do it? Then who did? And how did he happen to be on trial? And how did all this evidence get piled up against him? So it started off just as this sort of fictional exercise to entertain myself during a murder trial. And it occurred to me, I thought to myself, well, that would make an interesting premise for a novel. Somebody's on trial, the evidence against him is clear, but the reporter doesn't think he did it. And so he goes looking for the real killers, who of course don't want to be found. And that is the basic premise of my first novel, Burying the Lead. And so I left the newspaper to go to work in communications for the local hospital, a big Mercy Medical Center. And I was newly married. I had my brand new Apple IIe computer, to give you an idea how old I am. And I thought, well, it'd be fun to take a stab at that novel that I've been thinking about. So I wrote about 6 chapters. I created Tony Harrington, which is why I say he's been in my head for 35 years, because this was 35 years ago. I created Tony, the town of Orny, Iowa, the Town Crier newspaper. I wrote the chapter about the actual murders. And I don't remember exactly, but about 6 chapters were finished. And then life came along. Jane and I have 6 kids, not all at once, thank goodness, but 6 children came along. I went back to grad school and got my MBA and got promoted at work. And I followed my boss to Des Moines, took a similar but much bigger job at a much bigger medical center in Des Moines, and did lots of other things that you do as a parent and employee and somebody who's active in lots of different ways, still playing music on the weekends from time to time. So 2 things happened that caused me to finish the book. The first was that I had the cool idea for the plot twist. Tony Harrington was in my head in all those years, 25 years or so, that I didn't write very much, maybe not anything at all, but I still thought about him a lot. You know, I'd lie in bed at night before I fell asleep. I'd start thinking about the novel, and here's Tony Harrington in my head, and what plot twist, what plot points might you create? How might things go from here? What characteristics would this person have or that? So I was always thinking about it. And one night I had the aha moment where I thought, oh, that would be cool. And I read a lot. I always have 3 books going, and I probably read 2 books a week or something like that. And so it was a plot twist I'd never seen before. And it may not be unique. I don't pretend I've read every murder mystery that's ever been written, but it certainly was unique in my experience. So I was excited now to finish. I was taught by Hilary Masters when I was going to Drake. He said, never tell people your stories, because then you'll really want to get them out on paper. And that was really true. Once I had this cool idea for what was going on behind the scenes, I was so anxious to get it out on paper because I couldn't tell anybody. I forced myself to not reveal it to anyone. So anyway, that happened. Now I'm excited to get it done. But you still don't, you just don't, somehow you don't get around to doing it. So the second thing that happened was I went to lunch with some Mercy executives, and it was a thank you luncheon. The chief nurse took me as a planner and some other people out to lunch to say thank you for a project we had finished. And the facilities guy who worked arm in arm with me on major facilities projects, a good friend of mine, Ron says to the table, "Did you know Joe's writing a novel?" And the chief nurse said, "I don't want to hear about his stupid novel. He's had the same 6 chapters done for 25 years. So, everyone chuckles, conversation moves on. But I went home that night and said to Jane, I'm going to finish the book. And she was surprised. I still had a big job. We still had 6 kids, and by then, at least one of our grandchildren. And she was surprised that it had come up. She hadn't heard anything about it in a long time. But I said, I don't intend to publish it. I just want it to be done. I want my kids to be able to say, my dad wrote a novel, rather than having to say, my dad always talked about writing a novel. So I vowed that day, this was in October, about, 4 or 5 years ago. I should figure that out one of these days so I could tell people precisely. But in any case, I vowed that day to write something on the book every single day until it was done. Even if it was one sentence, said I'm going to get it out on my desk at home, which is where I'm sitting now, by the way, in my home office. I'm going to get it out on the desk at home, and I'm going to leave it out, and I'm going to write something every day. Even if I have a 12 or 14-hour workday, I can write a sentence before I go to bed. Well, you know what happens. You don't write one sentence. You sit down and write the one sentence that you're obligated to write, and then you write a second one, and before you know it, you've written 3 pages, and finally you go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever. So after I made that vow, 4 months later, the book was finished. And the only day I missed was Christmas Day. I didn't even miss Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. I missed Christmas Day, house full of company. But in January, the book was finished. And then I retired in July of 2018. And I said to Jane, well, rather than sit around and stare at you, drive you crazy all day, maybe I'll try to do something with the book. So I went looking for a literary agent, and I wasn't having any luck. And I was talking to John Shores one day, and if we have time, I can tell you about how a couple of published authors were enormously helpful to me. John Shores was one of those. If you haven't read his stuff, you should. Beneath the Marble Sky is a spectacularly good book. His first novel set in India, and it's about the Taj Mahal. And I highly recommend, I've recommended it to people for 10 years, almost nonstop. Anyway, I was talking to John Shores. I'm a big fan, and he's originally from Iowa. He lives in Denver now. But I said, I'm having trouble finding a literary agent. And he said, don't feel bad, so am I. And I said, how is that possible? You were on the New York Times bestseller list for months. Beneath the Marble Sky has been published in 7 languages. I said, how, that was the most discouraging thing I'd ever heard. And he said, one, it's really hard to find an agent that's worth the money they charge. And he said, nowadays, everything's done online. 90% of what agents used to do, you can do for yourself. His advice was stop looking for an agent, go find a publisher. And so that's what I did. I started telling people I was looking for a publisher, and one of those conversations where the person you're talking to says, well, I know a guy who's a principal in a publishing firm. And so I met with Tony, and ironically, his name is Tony. I gave him a draft of the book. Book Press Publishing is based here in Iowa. They had 4 people read it. They all really liked it, came back and said they wanted to work with me. We negotiated a deal, and the rest, as they say, is history. So Burying the Lead came out in December of 18. Technically, the copyright date is 2019, but the first copies were distributed in December of 18. And it's won 2 awards. It's in its 2nd printing, and I think they've sold books in 44 states now, and 1 in India. Those of you who follow me on Facebook might have seen my post that 1 guy in India bought my book, so I'm now an international author. But I mentioned the awards, you know, obviously it's fun for people to know that and stroke your ego, that's great. But really, I encourage you to think about the alternative. You know, after 35 years, can you imagine if the book hadn't been well received, how devastating that would have been? And so I'm very grateful and honored that it's gotten the rave reviews and the reception that it has. So, you know, when it comes out, you become a marketer and you go on the circuit and you do author talks and all this stuff. But I soon found that Tony Harrington was still in my head. You know, when I go to bed at night, these characters were still alive to me. And so I pretty quickly said, you know, I'm still retired. I should write another book. And so I went looking for a topic. And for those, if you haven't read the book or haven't finished it, I don't want to give away too much, but Burying the Lead has a big plot. You know, it goes from a simple murder trial to a plot involving powerful people on a much broader scale, geographically as well as politically and everything else. And so I knew I didn't want to follow that with what they call a cozy mystery, you know, Agatha Christie type, where everything happens in the parlor of an old house. I wanted a big topic. And so I thought, well, I'll have Tony take on human trafficking. It's a big topic. It's in the news. It's, you know, it's filled with opportunities for a writer with all of the legal and social and emotional and, you know, all the complex issues around it. The surprising facts, which I sort of had a hint of from a conversation I'd had with a sheriff a while before, but as I got into the research, I learned so much more, just mind-boggling how horrific and how prolific that world is. So anyway, I did the research. I had wonderful help from a woman who runs Dorothy's House here in Des Moines, which is a facility that takes young women who've been rescued from sexual slavery and treats them and helps them reacclimate into normal society. And Kelly was fantastic help to me. And so I did that research and I met with Kelly and I did those things. When I sat down to write Cry from an Unknown Grave, it's longer than Burying the Lead. This is 342 pages, I think. And I wrote it in 33 days. The first book took 33 years. The second book took 33 days. Once I started writing this, I could not stop. I was up every night until 3 or 3:30 in the morning. And Jane was kind of worried about me, you know, but I just couldn't stop. And so, of course, when it was finished, the editing process was much more arduous because you write anything that fast, it needs work. And I think we did 6 or 7 rounds of editing, but the writing of it went extremely fast. And this just came out, officially released October 18th. It's been available from my website since about August, but the official release date in bookstores and online services was October 18th. And it's also been very well received. For those of you who've seen it, the back includes a blurb from Max Allan Collins, who's another great writer. He's an Iowa author of mystery thrillers, writes a lot of noir type detective fiction. He's written over 200 books. He wrote The Road to Perdition. That's how most people know him. He also wrote the Dick Tracy comic strip for years. So Max is another guy I really admire, and I was thrilled to get a blurb from him for my cover. But one that's a little less, you might expect a little less, is at the bottom from Danielle Feinberg. Danielle is the director of photography at Pixar in California. And I was, as you can imagine, over the moon when she agreed to write a blurb for the book. I met her when she was in Des Moines giving a speech, and I was telling her how entertaining she was. She was fantastic. It was one of the best talks I've ever seen. And I was telling her that, but she wanted to know about me. What do you do? And so I told her I was retired, but now I'm writing murder mysteries. And she just wanted to know all about it. She thought that was so cool. And turns out when she got on the airplane to fly back to San Francisco, she bought my first book on Kindle and read it on the airplane, finished it a couple weeks later, and she's been a fan. I think she would forgive me for saying that. So anyway, this has been a lot of fun, and right now I'm in the middle of promoting Cry from an Unknown Grave, and to the extent you all can help me do that, it would be lovely. But I just kept writing then. I haven't had another experience where I've written a novel in 33 days. But the third one is coming out in March, and that's this, The Third Side of Murder. And in it, Tony Harrington accompanies his mother back to Italy to a family funeral. If those of you who've read Burying the Lead may recall, his mother is a first-generation Italian. She and Charles met when he was in Italy filming a movie. And so Tony accompanies his mother back to her hometown and realizes his young cousin was murdered and goes looking for the killer and finds out the killer is a mafia hitman. So he gets sideways with the mafia. And I'm not giving away the end. You learn all of that in the first couple of chapters. The story is really him chasing this mafia hitman back to New York City and trying to figure out how to bring him to justice without getting himself and his friends killed in the process. So the whole story takes place in Italy and New York, which is a great treat for me as an author to write something set in those other places. He interacts with his boss back in Orny by telephone, and it's not like Orny, Iowa's forgotten. It shows up in the story, but almost all of the action occurs in Italy and New York. Writing about Italy was very challenging. I've been there. I've been blessed to have been there, and I love it. But I hadn't thought about all of the things you don't know about a foreign country when you sit down to write about it. You know, do they have convenience stores attached to their gas stations? You know, what do they call their restaurants, and do they have menus? You know, what's their cell phone coverage like? I mean, there's just so much you don't know. And a real great example of that, the story takes place in Amalfi on the southwest coast of Italy. And there was a scene where Tony confronts, other way around. Tony is following this mafia guy, and the mafia guy confronts Tony in the train station. And after the book was all written and we're in the editing process, maybe round 2, it occurs to me, I don't really know that Amalfi has train service. And, most European places do, but maybe I should check. And sure enough, there's no train in Amalfi. And so I had to change it to the bus station. But things like that can trip you up pretty easily. I really should pause and ask you guys if you have questions along the way. I've been rambling here so fast and furious. Anything you want to know about Burying the Lead or Cry from an Unknown Grave before I wrap up with novels 3, 4, and 5?
I think you're doing great, Joe. Keep on going.
All right.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that is taking on a lot to do another country, and then also even New York. Did you have to spend a lot of time in New York?
Well, yeah, New York I've been to a lot. I happen to love it. I'm a big fan of Broadway. And one of the things we've done, God bless my wife, she stays at home and takes care of everything. But over the years, we've taken each of our kids to New York City. I've taken each of our kids to New York City to experience Broadway. So I've probably seen 18 or 20 Broadway shows, and I've been to New York a lot. So that was pretty easy, really. I mean, as long as you're talking about Manhattan. If I'd said it in Brooklyn, I might have been in trouble. But I know Manhattan pretty well, and even to the extent that I got out of a cab at 140th Street one time and realized I was in the heart of Harlem at 1 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, I know New York pretty well. One quick story I would share about the third side of murder. Gosh, I've gone so fast here. I've left out some things I might have wanted to share with you. But the reason it's in Amalfi is that the opening scene, this ballet dancer, this is his young cousin dancing, and she's dancing on a seawall. And she's practicing ballet standing on top of this stone seawall. And she's thinking to herself about how the seawall is a perfect metaphor for life, where on one side is sunshine and flowers and people and activity, and you can choose happiness and sunshine. And on the other side is the abyss that falls down to the rocks and the ocean and certain death, and how every day of our lives we have to choose, and how fortunate she is to have grown up the way she did, and she chooses life. And then this guy throws her off the seawall. So I needed a seawall to open the book. And as I mentioned, I've been to Italy, but I've been to interior cities primarily like Rome and Florence. And the only coastal city I've been to is Venice, which doesn't have seawalls. They just let the ocean wash over them. So I went looking for a seawall, and I went to Google Earth and literally pulled it up on my computer and scrolled down the coast of Italy, looking at actual pictures of the coast until I found a seawall that looked like what I had envisioned in my head. And that's why it's set in Amalfi, because that's where the seawall was. It's a great example of how these tools, the internet, Google Earth, those kinds of things have made it possible for a guy who's lived in Iowa all his life to write a realistic story set somewhere else. So that's the third novel. It's coming out in March, if everything goes according to plan. And I'm excited about it. Cry from an Unknown Grave is a very dark story because that subject of human trafficking is just so ugly. And while murder's never pleasant, in the third side of murder, it's not so dark. You don't see her get murdered. You only know that it happens. And the story is much more of an adventure story of first chasing and then trying not to get killed by this very nasty guy. The fourth book is called Performing Murder, and it's also finished. And in it, Hollywood comes to Iowa to film a movie on location. And a famous actress is found floating face down in the Orney Country Club swimming pool. Somebody close to Tony gets accused of the crime. And once again, the evidence is pretty convincing, but Tony just can't believe it's possible. And so he goes looking to try to poke holes in the evidence, try to figure out what really happened. That book was fun. And again, I don't want to give away too much, but one really fun part of that, there's a company in Iowa called Sukup Grain Bins, Sukup Manufacturing, and they make heavy steel products like grain bins. And I happen to know their CEO, Steve Sukup, served in the legislature when I was doing advocacy for Mercy, and they're located near Mason City, so I knew the family just because they're prominent in that area. So in Performing Murder, I wanted Tony's life to be in peril, and I was trying to think of something unusual. I didn't want somebody to pull a gun on him or threaten him with a knife or poison him, you know, all those things we've seen 1,000 times. And so it occurred to me, gosh, it's set in rural Iowa. I'll have the bad guy throw him in a grain bin. If you know anything about grain bins, they are incredibly deadly places. And so I called Steve Sukup at Sukup Manufacturing and said, I'm thinking about having this guy die or nearly die in a grain bin. Is that okay with you? You know, because I didn't want to offend him. And I said, you know, I'll put Sukup's name on it if you'll let me. And Steve was like a little kid. He's absolutely, he just thought that was the greatest thing ever. And so I asked for his help. So I said, you know, Tony's got to be in serious danger. And the way he escapes can't just be something convenient, you know, where, oh, there happens to be a ladder here where I need it, you know. So is there any way to survive when you get trapped in the grain, once they turn the augers on? And Steve said, I'm sorry, Joe, there isn't. That if you get waist deep, 4 of the strongest men on the planet cannot lift you out of there. There is no escaping. And I said, man, I got to come up with something. And he said, well, wait a minute. There was one case of this guy who did something completely counterintuitive and survived. And I said, tell me what that was. So he did, and you'll have to wait to read the book. I've given away too much already. But it was so much fun to have the CEO of the grain bin company helping me to craft this chapter where Tony very nearly dies. And by the way, he
Sucked you down like quicksand, or?
Yeah, if you don't know about this, Susan, it is, the grain bins have augers in the bottom. So when you want to empty them, this auger turns and the grain gets pumped out of the bottom. So it is just like a suction process where once you're in that grain and it's being sucked to the bottom, it just pulls any object on top down underneath. And lots of people die that way.
They go in to unplug it or to do something, and they go into it, and then they end up getting sucked into it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and sadly, a lot of these cases are you know, the 60-year-old farmer sends his son in, says, you know, take this 2x4 and go unplug that. Yeah, so they're very deadly places. And lots of other kinds of accidents too, where the grain will be piled up against one wall and you'll be inside and it'll come down like an avalanche. I mean, there's lots of ways it can happen, but when the bin's mostly full and you turn on the augers, it's all over. And that's what the bad guy does. And Tony survives it through this very unusual, once in a lifetime kind of thing, which I'm so excited about. The fifth book I'm writing right now, it's called A Two-Bit Murder, and that's just a working title. I may have to come up with something better, but I called it that because it starts with a coin toss. Tony and his DCI buddy are on a stakeout together, and they toss a coin to see who has to go buy lunch. And Tony notices that the coin is a 60-year-old quarter, back when quarters still had real silver in them. And it makes him curious, and he goes looking for the source of where the quarter came from and uncovers a 60-year-old bank robbery and murder. And so I'm having a tremendous amount of fun with that story as well. And then you can be the first to hear, 3 or 4 days ago, while I was writing book 5, my 20-year-old son stuck his head in my door and said, have you ever thought about writing this? And gave me a fantastic idea for book 6.
Wow.
So I'm anxious to get 5 done because I got to get started on number 6. So that's the only thing I skipped over that I normally or almost always cover is the titles. Those of you with journalism background understand burying the lead is a newspaper expression. That means the important stuff is going on beneath the surface. So I thought it was a great title for a murder mystery. The publisher wanted me to spell this L-E-A-D, even though newsrooms spell it this way. We really went round and round about that, and I put my foot down and said no. One, I was worried if it was spelled L-E-A-D with a silhouette of a rifle on the cover, it would be read by everyone as burying the lead, and that would be misleading and not nearly as interesting, in my opinion. And I said to them, if people don't understand it, isn't that a good thing? If I'm looking at the shelf in a bookstore and I don't quite understand what that means, am I more or less likely to pick it up and look inside the flap and see what it's about? So I didn't think it was all bad to have a little bit of mystery in the title. Cry from an Unknown Grave actually comes from a Longfellow quote, and I'm not going to read to you tonight, but let me just read you the quote. It's very brief. Longfellow lived in the 1860s, and he wrote a series of poems about slavery. And as I've mentioned, human trafficking is slavery. And so I went and looked at his stuff, and he said this: these are the woes of slaves. They glare from the abyss. They cry from unknown graves. So I just thought it was a great title for a dark story about an ugly part of humanity. And the third side of murder comes from an actual mafia guy. It's funny, I've debated how much to call him that. You know, if you look him up on Google, they call him mafia kingpin, but I'm not so sure I want to put that in. So anyway, at the moment in the draft, it says, there are 3 sides to every story: mine, yours, and the truth. From Joe Messino, boss of the Banana crime family. So third side of murder is referencing, there's your story, there's my story, and then there's what really happened. And that gives you a hint about the book. So while I'm thinking of it, there's the website. Some of you have been there already, but it's very simple, just joesphlevalley.com. You can read the opening chapters of future books. You can, obviously you can buy my books. You can learn about upcoming author talks. You can even hire Tony Harrington to write a newspaper story about you. Yeah, so go to the website and check it out, joesphlevalley.com.
So
With that,
Joe,
I'm going to take a
number
breath and
four
see.
coming out. You said number 3 is coming out in March. When's the
Right.
4th one coming out?
You know, we haven't even talked about that yet. A lot, of course, depends on sales of book 2 and then sales of book 3 and what's going on with the virus. When we scheduled book 3 to come out in March, we assumed at the time by then the virus would be gone, the book festivals would be happening next summer. And so the publisher really wanted to get it out in time. There's several book festivals in the Midwest that occur in the spring, including the Des Moines Book Festival, which is, I think, the last weekend in March. So that was sort of the thinking there. Now, of course, who knows? I mean, we may have a vaccine and everything will be hunky-dory, and we may not. And so it just depends. It's a long-winded way of saying I don't know. I think readers appreciate it if they find characters they like and an author they like. I think they appreciate not having to wait 2 years for the next book, which is what happened with Burying the Lead and Cry from an Unknown Grave. So the publisher and I have agreed that doing them on a little faster schedule makes sense, but neither one of us is willing to go bankrupt to get it done. So we have to sell some books along the way to make it work. So thank you for the question, though. What other questions you have about writing process or journalism days or publishing experiences?
Well, I have a question. What made you decide to base Tony Harrington in Iowa?
Well, you know, they always say write what you know, and that's probably the primary reason is having lived in Iowa all my life and worked in newspapers in Iowa, I felt like I knew this guy. I knew his bosses. I knew the town. And it is a fictional town. I did that really on purpose because I've lived here all my life and I've only lived in 4 different places. I didn't want the people in Mason City or the people in Boone or the people in Waukee wondering, well, who is that? You know, who is the mayor? Is he really, you know, is he poking fun at George? You know, I didn't want any of that. So I thought it was really important for Orny to be a fictional town. And it also allowed me to make it whatever I needed it to be in terms of the locations of things. And, you know, I put it on the Raccoon River. Raccoon River's in the novels is probably actually bigger and in a little different location than it is in real life. But anyway, it allowed me to make it what I wanted it. I also think, you know, if I set it in New York or Los Angeles, there's an awful lot of really good writers doing that already. I'm probably not gonna write a better story about Los Angeles than Michael Connelly, you know. And even Chicago, you know, there's a ton of really good mystery fiction set in Chicago. So it just gave me a chance to do something a little bit different. By the way, in case you don't think to ask it, here's my favorite question I usually get asked. How much of Tony Harrington is me? And I love that question because I always say, well, let's see. He's young, tall, handsome, smart, brave. Yeah, that's me. You know, but no, I tell people in all honesty, Tony Harrington's who I wish I was. It's not who I am. And I gave him a few of the traits that are me, that just make it easy to write about the character, easy to remember what you said about him just by borrowing stuff about yourself. For example, he drinks diet pop. He doesn't drink very much alcohol. He's not a teetotaler, and I'm not, but he drinks very little alcohol and really consumes gallons of diet pop. So things like that, you know, he curses, but he hates himself when he does it. Those kinds of things that you pull out of yourself just out of convenience as much as anything. But at his core, he is smarter and braver, certainly braver than me. I wouldn't go near some of the things that he ends up getting into. And yeah, I think of him like an imaginary friend.
Joe, I love murder mysteries and thrillers, and I always wonder when you're building your book and your story, do you know how it's going to end, or do you have your characters kind of do their thing and then figure it out at the end, or how do you map it out?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it because I've done it every which way. Burying the Lead was carefully crafted in the sense that I thought about it for 25 years before I finished it. I never did an outline. I never wrote anything down that said, here's what's going to happen. But I thought about it for so long that once I finally took the time to write it, it felt like it was already written. I just had to get it on the page. The second book, Cry from an Unknown Grave, I just started writing. I knew I wanted it to start with that phone call. So at the end of the first novel, and again, for those of you who haven't read the first book, I'm not giving anything away. At the end of the first novel, everything's, you know, resolved. He's exhausted. He climbs into bed late at night, and he's just glad to finally be able to get some sleep. And then the last line of the first novel is, at 3 a.m. his phone rings. So it sort of sets you up that, oh, you know, he's not done yet. Something else is going to happen. So I knew I wanted the second book to start with that phone call. But when I sat down to write it, I didn't have, pardon me, anything in mind beyond that. And I didn't have anything written down at all. And it just poured out. I've never had a writing experience like it. It just poured out of me. And toward the end, there were some things I knew I wanted to do. For example, I knew Tony couldn't solve human trafficking in this novel, obviously. And I didn't want it to be a novel of despair. That's not what mystery readers go looking for, and it's not much fun for the author either. So I knew that I had to create a finite piece of human trafficking that he could solve. And so I had him get on the trail of a specific ring of human traffickers. And I had him help a couple of specific individuals. And so that, again, for those of you who've read it, there's a scene toward the end of the book where he helps this young woman figure out how to rescue her life. And that felt really good. And I didn't know what that was going to be as I sat down, but I knew I wanted that to happen, that I wanted something near the end. And in fact, that is how the book ends, with her walking into a new, better life. And so I knew I wanted that, but I didn't know what it would entail or how I was going to pull it off. It just poured out of me. Then book 3 was kind of a traditional writing process. It took about 5 months, and I didn't outline it, but I had some plot points, like a 1-page sort of, well, this would be a good way for it to flow. In book 4, I did a pretty lengthy formal outline, which I had never done before. Now, interestingly, when I finished book 4, I never looked at the outline. Just the act of creating it helped organize my thoughts. And it was kind of interesting to me after I was finished to go back and look at the outline and, oh, I forgot about that. I didn't do that. But I liked the way it turned out. And then I could show you very easily, I think, if I can figure out what I do. Oh, yeah. So this is the one I'm working on now, book 5. Ended up being a whole jumble of notes. And so I've just done it every which way. And when I talk to writing classes or journalism students, I tell them what I've learned is there's no one right way. It's what the story requires. It's what you need as an author at the time. I've done it every which way. It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer.
Who is your favorite mystery author?
John Sanford, probably. And if you don't read Sanford's stuff, you absolutely must. He's an absolute master in dialogue. I met him. I have my picture with him. He actually asked me to autograph one of my books for him, which was like a huge thrill. But I told him, and I tell a lot of people, if I could write dialogue like John Sanford, I never would have been a healthcare executive. I would have been a novelist from the get-go. It is just a joy to read his stuff because the interaction of his characters is so real and yet so entertaining and fun. You know, I mentioned I rode around a lot of cop cars, and I had my camera and notepad at a lot of tragic situations, traffic accidents, and horrible things. And what you learn is that police and firefighters deal with that stuff with humor. They are completely sacrilegious when it comes to how they talk about victims so when you read Sanford's stuff and you see he and his buddies making jokes at the scene of a crime, this is how it really worked. He was, if you don't know, Sanford was his real name is John Camp, and he was a reporter for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. So he has a newspaper reporter's background as well. He tells a great story about, he wrote his first novel and found an agent, but the agent said, I can't sell this novel. It's very well written, but there's no audience for it because the protagonist is a chauvinist, so women are going to hate it. And something or other happens, so men are going to hate it. And she said, I can't sell it, so try again. So he went back and wrote his second novel. And she called him up. He sends it to her, a few months later. She calls him up and says, this is great. I think I can sell this for $300,000 or $400,000. And John said, okay, do that. Which I just thought was hilarious. Okay, do that. But anyway, I love Sanford, but I mentioned Max Collins, if you're not prudish, because Max writes very, his Corey character is set in the 50s and 60s, very chauvinistic. Nate Heller, his character, the noir fiction detective, set in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, even into the 60s, some very chauvinistic. And so the comments about the babes' gams, it's very traditional that way, which doesn't thrill everybody, but they're great stories and they are great characters. And I really like Max's writing. I read Michael Connelly's stuff. I read Joe Nesbo's stuff for a long time, but it got so, mentioning Nesbo reminds me of something that I like to explain to people, if you don't mind taking another minute. Tony Harrington is a really nice Iowa boy. He actually grew up in Chicago, but I paint him as a very nice, middle of the road, average sort of Iowa guy. And there's a specific reason for that. Because I mentioned I read a lot, there's two kinds of protagonists in thriller fiction. There's the can do no wrong superhero, you know, Jack Reacher, Jason Bourne, James Bond, you know, that whole genre of the, you know, once that guy's, you know, Jack Rapp, you know, once he's on the job, the bad guys are in serious trouble because he never could lose. And the other type is the Joe Nesbo, Harry Hole character, or Harry Bosch from Michael Connelly, who are alcoholics, twice divorced. Their boss hates them. They don't speak to their kids. You know, their life is a wreck. And those are very common as well. And I didn't want to write either end of that spectrum. I didn't think I could write the superhero type and do it nearly as well as all those people who've done it for so long. And I didn't want to write the down and out drunkard. It's just not much fun. And again, it's not me, and hard for me to relate. For all kinds of reasons, I didn't want to do that. So I decided to make Tony just a really nice, solid guy. But then I knew if I did that, that really bad things had to happen to him, or else the book just becomes a cartoon. You know, if it's going to have any gravitas at all, Tony has to experience really bad things. And he does. If you've read Bearing the Lead, you know what I'm referencing. So, so that's how I've approached it. And I got off track from the question. You'll learn that's typical. It's nothing unusual, but I think it's worth understanding where he came from that perspective. Great questions, you guys.
Well, Joe, thank you. This was fun.
Well, I appreciate you joining us. It's really nice to have someone from far away interested in, so thank you so much. And, you know, because of Zoom, I can,
fan club.
yeah. Well, I'm doing these talks for book clubs and service clubs and libraries all over the place. I did a book club in Idaho. And so feel free to recommend it. If you find it interesting or fun, feel free to recommend it. I'd love to keep doing them. And thank you all so much for your support. I appreciate it very much.
Well, I'm waiting for 3 and 4 now. Get them going.
You know, I'm happy to take your money in advance if you want. If you want to get on the list. Dawn, did we cover what you hoped to cover?
Oh, absolutely. And so much more. Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for working with us through all the ups and downs of the unknown of the pandemic. Are you coming? Can you not come? Can we have a meeting? Can we not have a meeting?
Well, I'd still love to come up sometime. And as you know, with another book coming out in the spring, I'll be pushing people for places to talk. So keep me in mind to do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Any final questions for Joe? Okay. Well, thank you all
Brave
for
enough to
coming.
ask me to talk again. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, Dawn.
Have a good night.
It was fun.